Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third installment of the Kush.com Last Prisoner Project webinar series. I am so excited to have two incredible members of our policy team with me today. And like I said, this is the third in the series, and we're so grateful to Kush.com for giving us this platform. It's been an amazing opportunity for us to raise awareness about this issue, but also inform and educate about Last Prisoner Project and the work that we do. On the first webinar, we had our founders on. We talked through the impetus for the organization, as well as a lot of our direct service programs. And then last month, we had three of our constituents on discussing their experience of being incarcerated for cannabis-related offenses, and then working with Last Prisoner Project through our reentry program. But so we've had more of a focus on our direct services, but as I always say at Last Prisoner Project, underpinning all of that work is our policy and our advocacy work. We could not do these direct service programs without a lot of advocacy at the local, state, and the federal level. So again, very excited to get to dive into the work that our policy team is doing and really examine in this moment where there is such a focus on criminal justice reform, reimagining law enforcement, reimagining our justice system. How can legalization be a tool to redress all of the disparities that are so in the focus in the public eye right now? So with that, I would like to introduce our panelists for today and ask you guys to do a brief introduction of yourselves. I'm going to start with our Director of Criminal Justice Law and Policy, Mickey Belina.
Thanks, Sarah. So as Sarah mentioned, my name is Mickey Belina, pronouns they, them. And I came to Last Prisoner Project. So I'm a lawyer by trade. Like I went to law school, got a JD, etc., but chose not to practice and got my start doing street and gang violence reduction work in Boston, working and leading a community organization alongside some other folks, and did that for a few years. And just to try and get proximate, as Brian Stevenson would say, to the issues that I was trying to solve. Eventually, I went then to the Vera Institute of Justice to do criminal justice, mass incarceration research, and TA work, which is technical assistance, which is basically criminal justice consulting for governments who are looking to try and decarcerate. From there, I went independent and started working with organizations on my own, just looking for innovative organizations that were looking for innovative ways to address criminal justice reform. And that's how I got to LPP, just because I saw that they're taking an innovative approach as to how we can solve mass incarceration. And I'm looking forward to talking about that more with everybody today.
Thank you so much, Mickey. And next, board member and policy advisor, Natalie Papillon. Natalie, if you could briefly introduce yourself.
Thanks for having me. I'm Natalie Papillon, like Sarah mentioned, board member at Last Prisoner Project, as well as a policy advisor. Prior to my work with Last Prisoner Project, I was the executive director of an organization called the Equity Organization, which was focused on advancing research, scholarship, and advocacy at the intersection of drug policy and criminal justice reform, with a special focus on cannabis, which is why I'm so excited to be here with Kush.com today. In a prior life, I was working in the private sector, doing branding, strategy, marketing for various, large technology companies. And, I've been really excited to be able to bring some of the lessons learned in the private market to sort of advocacy and nonprofit work with Last Prisoner Project.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for joining us today. I have so much that I want to talk with you guys about the research and scholarship that you have been engaged in, particularly for the past few months. But Natalie, I think we're going to spend a lot of today focused on the impact that the war on drugs has had and that prohibition has had, and then of course on what solutions we can drive from your findings. But I want to start because, as you mentioned, before coming to LPP, you founded an organization, the Equity Org, and you have done a ton of incredible research into the impetus for both prohibition and the war on drugs, and really teasing out the racial animus that I think was at the core of why those laws were put in place. Could you kind of give briefly an overview of your findings that kind of interrogate the racial animus of those laws?
Of course, and feel free to cut me off. I could talk anyone's ear off about this, but I think to start with where we are now and to look backwards, a lot of the conversations around drug policy reform and specifically cannabis policy reform tend to center on the inequities and injustices as they relate to the enforcement of our cannabis laws. And while those disparities are great and horrifying and need to be rectified, in fact, eliminated, I think one of the things that is often lost in the conversation is, to put it quite simply, the reason marijuana or cannabis was made illegal was because of racism and xenophobia. We can look back into the early 1800s, notwithstanding the other sort of historical usage of the plant. But when we center on North America and the United States more specifically, we know that marijuana are commonly prescribed by doctors and pharmacists and over-the-counter purveyors starting in the early 1800s and then through the 1930s. And for most people, this was like taking an Advil or a Tylenol. Not much was thought about it. We see in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, we see an influx of Mexican immigration into the southwestern parts of the United States. And from there, what we also see is, reflects a lot of what we're going through right now, is a zealotry and an anti-immigrant sentiment that really caused politicians and other people in power to try and find a way to further demonize these, dark-skinned Spanish-speaking immigrants who were thought wrongly to be sort of taking away American and really Anglo-American jobs and social opportunities. Because there was a history of cannabis consumption by those populations, that was the first thing many politicians turned to sort of relate the inherent quote-unquote degeneracy of these Mexican American immigrants. And at the same time, we see a very similar story happening in the Southeast with African American communities who were enjoying a time of increased political and social and economic enfranchisement. And in order to sort of keep up this rigid racial stratification, the powers that be found it necessary to demonize that group of people, so we could have like a very waspy Anglo-led society. And because of various reasons, cannabis consumption was also highly correlated with many of these African American populations. Keep in mind, this is during Prohibition. So booze was really hard to come by. It was very expensive. And for various reasons, a lot of these immigrant and Black populations really enjoyed consuming cannabis. And it was quite foundational to many of the subcultures that popped up during this time, most specifically jazz. And, Prohibition ends in the US. The Federal Bureau of Alcohol Prohibition needs another substance to police, and they want to sort of keep up this white supremacist lens on the way the world and the country focuses, and they decide to go after marijuana or cannabis, criminalize its consumers, and make it so impossible for people to fight back against the injustices that were waged in the battle of this war on marijuana. Then we get into the 60s, 70s. We know Nixon really put his foot on the pedal, on the gas, when it comes to the criminalization of cannabis. And we know the disproportionate impact that's had in low-income Black and Latinx communities specifically, and just across the country and throughout the entire world.
Yeah, I think frequently we talk about the war on drugs. We talk about, moving into the 80s, the Reagan era, and the disparities there. But what I have found really interesting about your scholarship is looking specifically at prohibition. And I think, as you articulated, as we moved away from criminalizing alcohol, using cannabis as the new substance to really police and marginalize communities of color. And it's fascinating, I think, although just horrendous, when you look at even the legislative history for prohibition. the blatant racist remarks that were made of why this plant should be criminalized. And certainly, as you said, we have seen the racial animus of these laws from their inception play out in how they are actually enforced. And unfortunately, that continues today, despite widespread legalization, despite a majority of states having some form of decriminalization or legalization. We're still seeing huge disparities in arrest rates, in conviction rates, and in sentencing, despite equal rates of usage across populations. But I think especially because, of course, at Last Prisoner Project, a huge focus of our direct service work is around the release of those currently incarcerated for cannabis offenses. We spend a lot of time talking about that data. We often talk about how there's an estimated 40,000 individuals in the US currently incarcerated on cannabis-related offenses. But that data doesn't actually interrogate all of the ways that the impacts of these laws work to criminalize particularly communities of color. And I think what I'm really excited about the scholarship that you have been working on is looking at how individuals get wrapped up in the system prior to incarceration and the devastating consequences for communities before anyone is even convicted. Mickey, could you kind of walk us through what you have found in the ways that the war on drugs and prohibition in particular has increased those disparities pre-sentencing?
Yeah, sure thing. And like as Natalie talked about, and as you sort of preluded to, this all comes back down to the war on drugs and that cannabis prohibition, like from its inception, was to be a tool of the carceral state. And so, I mean, let's first talk about how the data just doesn't give the full picture, because I think that's why a lot of people in criminal justice world, in prison abolition world, et cetera, I think would understandably look at the numbers and say that cannabis is just not a priority in regards to when it comes to decarceration and trying to disempower, disentangle the systems of mass incarceration, because it's just not a big population. But what they miss is those numbers are just one small piece of a much bigger puzzle. So the thing is, while the numbers aren't very big in like state prisons, et cetera, as far as how you would compare to maybe other offenses, marijuana is often the hook that gets people into the system and allows then the system to decide what they want to do to them or do with them, which is often incarcerate and find a way to remove them from their communities. So it's one way I saw this like just in real time was when I was doing street and gang violence work. While a number of our guys were, they had gun charges and things like that, the things they were being picked up for were it was like a stop and frisk type situation where officer sees suspicious looking guy or a guy that he knows and wants to get him off the street because he just doesn't think he's a good guy, knows that or guesses that he likely has marijuana or something like that on him. And then a personal use amount in a legalized state, if this guy's on probation parole, gets him back into the arms of the system and they can figure out other ways to entrap and entangle. And unfortunately, that's just not a scary story. This is like every day across tons and tons of Black and brown communities. Like I literally was just getting my hair cut earlier, telling my barber about the conversation we're about to have. And he was talking about just the impact that he's seen cannabis prohibition have in Brooklyn, Bed-Stuy, especially early 2000s. And so this all talks to, when we're talking about early 2000s, this shows you how this ties back to the war on drugs piece, which is we got here because Nixon, the government, white supremacy, racism, et cetera, wanted to find a way that wasn't slavery to try and keep Black and brown folks in their place. So what they did, and we have direct quotes from, I don't know how to say his name, it's Ehrlichman or something, Nixon's domestic policy, one guy or another, that said, if we could get the public to associate Black and brown people with marijuana, or Black and brown people with crack cocaine and hippies with marijuana, then we could, and I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially disrupt their meetings, lock up their leaders, and essentially project and perpetuate violence on the very same communities that they did with slavery, right? So this is where these policies came from. And then that's what led us into the era on mass incarceration. Drug policy, which is really racial politics, got us to the tough on crime era. So you see increased drug policy, drug enforcement at the federal level. States and local jurisdictions follow suit. You see us enter the era of crime where you see mandatory minimums, 3-strike rules, et cetera. And this just continues to snowball. Now we've gone into the era of mass incarceration, where we've got, so pre-war on drugs, pre-1970, we had about 1 in 100 Americans behind bars, incarcerated. Track drug enforcement policy and war on drugs, in the high water mark around 2007, we have 1 in 1,000 Americans behind bars. So to say that cannabis isn't an integral part of criminal justice reform and an integral way out of mass incarceration is missing the full, you're looking at this piece of it when really this is just the tip of the iceberg. Everything that we're in now, cannabis has been a critical tool for the carceral state to continue doing what it's doing and maintain status quo. So it's like, yeah, you see decriminalization, and decriminalization is great, but it's not enough. It's like working at the iceberg tip level and ignoring everything below. If you fully legalize cannabis, which means fully remove and I'm talking about the police a lot, because that's the tool that they use to bring people into the system, because that's the entry point. That's what feeds the jails, and the jails feed the prisons. If you take that tool away from them, Black and brown communities are actually freer, because if it's completely out of the criminal sphere, that means the police cannot approach. The police can't interact, they can't intervene. And that automatically reduces Black and brown people's vulnerability to arrest, the expansion of which is what led people to being locked up in the first place. It was never about convicting people on cannabis. It was about cannabis is a really easy way to get people in the mix and then decide what to do.
And I think that's exactly why, we say 40,000 people, that's, based on FBI data that we have. But I always say that's a really low estimate, because we know often marijuana is the hook for these police interactions. But then, you end up getting hit with a number of other charges, that might not be the charge that you're eventually incarcerated for.
Can I say one more thing about the data? Sorry,
yeah.
When you talked about local data and the FBI data, it just reminded me that a critical thing that we also need to acknowledge is that our government at all levels does a really terrible job of collecting data, period. And it's like they often are working on paper systems. Sometimes the way that a file gets, and I've seen this like in action, I used to have to sit and just watch how a case moves through a jurisdiction system. And papers would get lost. Things are done on sticky notes. That stuff drops off. Every single agency across from cops to magistrates to prosecutor's office to defender's office to the county, all have different data collecting systems, different ways of language, definitions, et cetera. So realistically, it's like even the numbers we have, and they look really bad, and racial and ethnic disparities look really bad, we actually know that they're way, way worse. And so that's just like worth noting, which is like, even when we say how bad it is, it's just like the tip of the iceberg. So.
Yeah, and I'm actually going to ask you to go a little further there, Mickey, because when you were talking about the data, that I think touched on something that you touched on, but I'd like to go a little deeper into, which is that another huge gap in the data is around probation and parole violations. If someone's underlying offense is something other than cannabis, but then, they're roped in on a technical violation that might involve cannabis, that's also left out of the data. Could you give us just a little context for, I guess, maybe in your experience, like how common is it that marijuana might be the cause for someone to have a violation of their probation?
Sure. And I'm gonna talk about it from like two different hats. So on the one hand is like my experience of that phenomenon on the ground, like doing street and gang violence work, working with individuals more direct service level as an outsider. And then as an insider, trying to help systems basically declog their jails and get people out that aren't supposed to be there. So when I was like on the ground, I used one student story as like sort of a representation of this, where you would have guys that were doing everything right? Like, and there's a number of reasons, mostly trauma, bias, circumstance, et cetera, that leads people to the streets, survival economies, et cetera. And so this is like, these guys didn't have a chance from birth, right? But they've gone through their stuff. They've spent most of their time in the juvenile system, and then they're out, they're working with us, they're doing everything right. But that being said, the government, for the most part, would tell us not to work with these guys. So they didn't want to see them out in the streets in the first place. And probation and parole is really set up for them to fail. These are guys that are already economically marginalized, have really zero employment opportunity given their records and what is the collateral consequences that come with basically being system involved for that, period, but for that long. So they're serving these ridiculous probation sentences, and then a cop just chooses to, like, he looks wrong, like my guy looks wrong on the streets, he's walking from, like, whatever. He approaches him, and this guy has maybe like a J on him or rolling papers or something like that. Something that has nothing to do with what got this guy incarcerated in the first place, and has nothing to do with whether or not he should be out in the community. But because that guy has a J on him, and it's a condition of his probation and parole to not do drugs or not touch drugs or not be in contact with anybody who does drugs, and that gets into housing stuff, is a whole nother conversation. This guy can be he can be arrested on the spot. I mean, it depends on the jurisdiction, but very often, like, cannabis can be used. The discretion is there. He can be arrested. He can be thrown in jail for who knows how long, right? Because, I mean, it's not, our courts aren't a speedy process, and it's like they're not the top priority of people to get out of jail or prison because they wanted to put them there in the first place. And as a result, this guy ends up in this vicious cycle of incarceration where he keeps ending up back inside for things that have nothing to do with why he was incarcerated in the first place, nor does it do anything to address the recidivism. It does nothing to try and get him out of the system. So we have a lot of people who aren't convicted on marijuana offenses, but because of conditions of probation and parole, the system can continue to pull them back in and basically control these people's lives for up to, I mean, in Pennsylvania, counties have probation terms of up to like 5, 6, 7 years. I mean, I think they've tried to work on it and adjust it now, but it's just ridiculous. So your time served isn't done when your time is served, and marijuana is often the way that the system is able to keep punishing you. So.
Absolutely, and we see
Oh,
that.
sorry, I my bad. I realized I didn't do I promised that I would do it from the system solutions part as well, and I'll be short on that. But when I was working at Vera, and we're working with jurisdictions that are trying to like decarcerate their jails, one of the biggest issues we kept coming up against is like there would be a population of folks that they didn't want in their jails, right? They're like, these people should be out in the community, have no business. They're costing us money. We're like, it's a human toll, it's a social toll, all these things. We don't want them there. But they can't do anything with them because they're on a probation, they're on a hold, which means that they're being held incarcerated because of a probation or parole violation situation where the state or the feds have said, we want them incarcerated. They're back locked up because they pissed dirty, right? Like maybe they smoked a J and then failed a drug test that was a condition of probation and parole, and they're sitting in this jail, county jail, waiting for the states and the feds to decide what to do with them. The county doesn't even want them incarcerated. They're like, these people have no business. These people are not a danger. I want this guy working. But because of marijuana prohibition and the impact that it has on how people move through the system before, during, and after, the county literally can't do anything. I've seen there are people like sitting in jail for 120 days, months, like up to a year even, because they're on a probation hold for a rolling paper or a J or something like that in their car, and they really have no business being there. But I mean, that's why we need to legalize, really. It's just like, it makes no sense. And it's, anyway, so that's my thought.
Yeah, and I wanted to reflect on something that you brought up about how easy it is to get pulled back in for a low-level marijuana violation when you're on parole or probation, because this comes back to a lot of the work that we do around reentry. You know, we do have constituents coming out of incarceration that are interested in working in the legal cannabis industry. And unfortunately, of course, if you're on federal probation, it's simply not an option. But even in a state like California, where they have probably the country's most expansive ban the box law, you really cannot restrict someone from getting a job based on their criminal record. If you're on probation or parole for a cannabis violation, it still might be a violation for you to work in the industry. So I think that's another piece of this, that when we're adopting these laws, we really need to think through all of the ways that these barriers still exist to ensure that justice impacted individuals can have space in the industry, of course, on the ownership level, but even as employees in the industry. And that's a huge barrier that still exists. But something else that Mickey brought up that also I think, Natalie, was a part of your introduction was I also think it's fascinating, although quite disheartening, to see the parallels between the 60s and 70s, where we see all this language of, you know, policing protesters, policing those that were protesting the Vietnam War. And I think now we're seeing that again today with the protest around George Floyd's murder. We know that law enforcement is using drug offenses to police peaceful protesters. You know, the DEA was actually brought in and given the authority to be a part of that enforcement of protesters. So Natalie, I'd like you, if you can, to kind of touch on that, but I'd also like you to talk about, of course, the impetus for these protests, the continued police violence and murder of Black individuals. And I think what you found in your scholarship is that some of these really egregious examples of police brutality and even of murder have happened because of exactly what Mickey's describing, that cannabis was the hook that enforcement used for that initial interaction. Could you talk about that?
Happy to, yes. So there's a lot there. I think, you know, centering directly on what we're seeing play out on Twitter and on our phones and our TV screens day by day, I think we're all rightly horrified by the instances of police brutality that we're witnessing, and obviously there are many that we aren't. And this may be new to a lot of folks who weren't aware of how militaristic our police forces have become over the course of the past 3 or 4 decades. And for those shocked and scared and angry, I think it's really important that we also just realize that this happened once again because of the war on drugs. So there are a few really concrete examples. One is Section 1033. Now, this was introduced in the early 90s, enshrined into law in the late 90s, sort of at the height of the war on drugs in sort of political and public rhetoric. And what it does was allow the Department of Defense to give military-grade weaponry, uniforms, guns, mine-resistant tanks. I don't know why someone in suburban Atlanta needs a mine-resistant tank, but, you know, that was the decision that our legislature made. And they give them to these local police departments free of charge, provided the police pledge to use those pieces of equipment for counter narcotics operations. So the reason we see tanks in the street, the reason we see military grade weaponry up in your cul-de-sac is directly tied to the war on drugs. Section 1033, still in existence, has been expanded. 80,000 police departments or law enforcement agencies are accessing this program every year. And to add insult to injury, it's free. I mean, it's expensive to maintain. It's free, provided you use the equipment within a year. So not only is it like free stuff, let's use it. I mean, I like free stuff as much as the next person. You actually have to use it or you're going to lose money. So it's not even free in that case. But then there's the other side of it. You know, the equipment is free or very, very heavily subsidized, but maintenance is expensive. Training is expensive. Where as a law enforcement agency are you going to get that money? Drug bust and civil asset forfeiture. So it adds another element of it where you have this militarized equipment. You got to keep it up if you want to keep getting it. In order to do that, you have to basically seize the assets of people not convicted of a crime. For those not familiar with civil asset forfeiture, 80% of people who encounter this, you know, procedure are never charged with the crime. So that is the government going in saying, we have this like suspicion that maybe this piece of jewelry, this watch, this $500, this, you know, 1994 Honda Accord was involved in some drug-related activity. We're just going to take it, and it's up to you to prove it wasn't, which is, of course, a very costly time, you know, and there's no oversight. And the money is split between prosecutors and the police. So obviously there are a set of perverse incentives at play. SWAT teams like the one that killed Breonna Taylor. SWAT teams predate the war on drugs a bit, but they were established to deal with high risk, very intense situations, predominantly mass shooters, hostage situations. Apparently a lot of hostage situations in the 60s, or at least a lot of fear of it. So that was what the sort of standard rule was. War on drugs caused a rapid rise in the prevalence of SWAT teams. So now over 90% of all police departments in jurisdictions with over 50,000 people have a version of SWAT team, as well as departments you wouldn't even imagine would have one, like the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Education. They all have agriculture, have dozens, if not hundreds of SWAT teams at their disposal. I mean, I would love to see the sort of like insignia for that one. But so that happened. And then in 2014, it's gone up since then, an ACLU report found that 90% of SWAT deployments were in service of serving warrants. The vast majority, over 70% of them, were drug related. So you've had this thing, these forces that were supposed to be used sparingly and not supposed to be in every suburban location escalate 14,000 or 1,400% from the late 60s to the 90s. And then you see deployments sort of those SWAT teams increase similarly, and then they're not even being used for the things they were meant to be used for. They're used to no-knock arrests, to kill Breonna Taylor. So there is it's not even conceptual. Like, we can look at the legislation, see what authorized it, look at today's budget, see where that money is coming from, and we know this is a war on drug policy that's killing people and just economically very dumb. It just doesn't make any sense. It's not making our community safer. It's not making individuals safer. And it's not doing anything to stem drug-related violence or misuse, right? So that's really sort of examples of it. But we have like the COPS program, we have the Edward Byrne Memorial Justice Grants. Like, there's a lot there that speaks to the militarization of the police. And so I think we need to recognize that we can't just reform. We have to sort of start pulling a lot of these programs don't need to exist, and definitely not anywhere close to what the format they exist in now. It's a waste of time, resources, money, manpower, and it makes us actually less safe.
And
then,
go ahead, Natalie.
Oh no, and I got on my soapbox and I forgot the second part of your question. I'm so sorry.
Well, you touched on the first part, which is, some of the examples of when marijuana has been the inciting incident for some of these egregious examples. But something really interesting I know you've looked into is the recent deployment of the DEA to enforce peaceful protesters. And I think you kind of touched on this, but all the ways in which we give these various agencies these really perverse incentives to use military grade enforcement for something that really doesn't seem in their sphere. I think you touched on that, but if you want to add anything else to that.
Yes, I would say I focus a lot of my work on the DEA, but there are obviously other federal agencies who have definitely experienced mission creep, to put it in a very kind way, and are acting oftentimes unlawfully. The DEA it's a domestic organization, ostensibly. It has locations in 80 countries. There are very few domestic federal agencies that have 80 field offices in different countries. Interfering with civil wars in other countries, trying to kind of start one in our own, very little federal oversight, very little internal policies for flagging issues of corruption or, bad behavior, bad actors. In fact, I feel like every 3 weeks we see another scandal with a DEA agent or a DEA administrator. And I think they keep getting money. I mean, $36 billion a year is sort of our drug enforcement budget on the federal level. Now that, that won't even come close to what it looks like on the state, local, and tribal levels. We are pouring money into something that doesn't work, and we have no accountability, that, has very little accountability, and are quite literally on the ground abducting American citizens with no probable cause and no accountability attached to that.
Okay, so there's so much I want to unpack with you guys. I want to leave some time for Q&A. We've already got a ton of questions rolling in. So in the last 15 minutes, we'll turn to Q&A. If you have a question, put it in the Q&A. I want to move to solutions in the remaining time that we have. And I think, Natalie, I'm going to ask you, this is sort of straddling between the continued problem and solutions, but maybe to frame how we look at solutions. One thing I was actually just talking about was that even in states that have legalized or decriminalized, arrests are increasing in places. Certainly the disparity in arrest rates is increasing. But I was specifically talking about Manhattan and how the DA in Manhattan had come out and said, I'm no longer going to prosecute marijuana cases. We've seen similar statements, Maryland, Baltimore prosecutor, yet arrests continue. You obviously have just touched on a lot of the perverse incentives for law enforcement, I think more at a high level and for some of these agencies. Can you talk to maybe some of the perverse incentives for law enforcement on the ground and why we're still continuing to see arrest rates increase despite prosecutors saying, if you arrest folks for these crimes, we're not going to prosecute them?
So, there are three elements to sort of my response. One is, I will admit, in places like New York City, arrest rates have gone down. But that's only a shiny sort of metal that I think a lot of officials want to sort of pin to their lapel. We're still seeing, they've just been replaced by criminal summonses, which operate, and Mickey knows this so well, operate quite similarly. You know, just another way to sort of get someone into the system, and we switch to sort of like a managerial model of dealing with these cases, and so you're maybe not held in sort of pre-trial, and you might get off or just have a fee or a fine. But of course, if that's not paid, or if you do something else, or if you're caught again, or if you're not a first-time offender, quote unquote, or if maybe the judge on call doesn't like the way you're acting, or the police officer, obviously that can take very, very a very, very negative turn. And I think one of the other things we see is people are marking marijuana-related encounters very differently. So it's not technically classified as a marijuana-related arrest, but the local police forces have broad authority to demonstrate what is like a threat to public order, sort of like there are lots of other misdemeanor categorizations, and we're seeing anecdotally and through a little bit of sneakiness in the data, that's how a lot of people are like being able to report to the media that marijuana arrests are down, when the reality is they're not down as much as they should be. I think the other thing is, decriminalization, great. New York decriminalized in the late 70s. We just did it again last year. We saw that, in 1990, there were 1,000 marijuana arrests in New York. In 2010, there were 60,000. So this isn't a decriminalized state. So we have this thing called having cannabis in plain view. So you're technically not criminalized if you have it, but if you are stopped and frisked, which we know Black men and Latinx men, particularly in New York, were quite often subject to this, the first thing a police officer will tell you is empty your pockets. You empty your pockets, you have a joint in it. Guess what? Now that cannabis is in plain view, you're in violation of the law. I mean, it almost feels, so crazy that I can't believe I'm telling you this with a straight face, but this is how it works. I mean, that is why the language is put in there. The decriminalization movement had, sort of white suburban support. Mothers of college-age kids white mothers did not want to see their kids go to jail for marijuana. Fine. Okay, but we still need to get these people in the system, the Black and Latinx people in the system. So we're going to have this like weird 3-word loophole, and it worked super successfully. And we're still seeing that happen today. We're still seeing instances of police brutality that are marijuana related, if not totally marijuana driven. I mean, there have been 2 high profile incidents in the past 3 months in New York City where I'm based. So we have to realize that like those disparities, decriminalization just doesn't do enough. It doesn't really impinge on local law law enforcement agencies' authority to make those marijuana-related arrests, sadly.
Yeah, and I think there's a misconception when we talk about the distinction between decriminalization and legalization. I think people hear decriminalization and they think, oh, these are reform movements that are specifically focused on ensuring that arrests, convictions don't continue to happen for cannabis offenses. That's not really the case. And Natalie, you kind of unpacked the ways that, in fact, legalization, even if it's done in a way, I would say, earlier states like Colorado and Washington didn't come to it with as much of a restorative justice framework as some of the newer states legalizing, like California and Illinois. Yet we still see a dramatic decrease when full legalization is put in place, as opposed to decriminalization. And so I think that's something really important to note. Mickey, as we move into solutions, I hear frequently from you, given that the work you've done with jurisdictions on the ground prior to coming to LPP, that you're working with stakeholders, you're working with local officials, and they don't see legalization or even decriminalization as a tool to address some of these issues like mass incarceration, right? These are jurisdictions that are trying to lower incarceration rates, that are trying to move the needle on criminal justice reform, yet they're not seeing that marijuana legalization could be a tool to do that. But I've heard you say that when you're on the ground, marijuana offenses are always the things that you see that are part of the problem. How do you think we can work to show officials that this really can be a tool to redress these disparities in the criminal justice system?
Yeah, so I'm trying to think of how to answer it because it's like a lot of different ways. But I'll say like the big takeaway for like if there is something that I would want stakeholders to hear, it's that okay, our criminal legal system, it functions in silos. Like every agency, the police, the magistrates, the prosecutors, etc., they're just looking at what they're doing, right? The reason it's a system is because it has a systemic impact on the individual that actually moves through it. So the police do their damage and then send them off to the magistrates. And then they do whatever they want to do to them with bail. And then they send off to the prosecutors. And no agency is looking at really paying that much attention to who did what before them and who did what after them. So understanding that at every intercept of the criminal legal system, folks are getting sort of, I mean, we see disparities get worse and worse because as you move through the system, I mean, really your outcomes are worse and worse, especially if you're incarcerated, because we've seen that even just like 48 hours, possibly less of jail incarceration time. So you're not even convicted, you're still legally innocent, can have a whole host of lifelong collateral consequences and deleterious effects given what happens due to that incarceration. And it just automatically like diminishes all your capacities and health. But that being said, so if we're trying to solve mass incarceration, right, people focus on decarcerating prisons, which is great. We need to get people out of the prisons. But if you don't close the front door, you're just getting people out and then funneling them back in. So, well, yes, we should focus on decarcerating prisons. Another big critical issue or critical point or critical area of focus is closing that front door. And that means how do we stop people from funneling in and funneling continually in and through? And that's where cannabis comes into play, because one of the biggest things is how do you decarcerate your jails and get people, stop bringing people in that don't need to be in there and stop holding people in there that don't need to be in there, right? Just get them out to serve their time. I mean, first off, they shouldn't be serving time if it's for a nonviolent cannabis offense, period. But get them out of the community and let's try and like heal the harm that's been done. Cannabis is one way to do that. If you fully legalize like cannabis, and when I say legalize, like you sort of alluded to before, there's a lot of different ways you can do that. And I think states are continually trying to do it better and better, taking a comprehensive look at what legalization means. It's not just about, oh, people can smoke weed now. It's, oh, wow, we recognize that, or I mean, I would hope they recognize that cannabis legalization is really about trying to remedy and redress the harms that this country did to Black and brown people. That's what cannabis legalization is about. It just so happens that it also includes the fact that people are free to like use for personal use, et cetera, et cetera. But so if full legalization means police can't utilize marijuana in any way as a reason to even talk to a Black or brown person, anybody at that point, but really we're talking about Black and brown people here in terms of disparate impact and disparate effect. So if you legalize cannabis, people can't be brought into the system. So that just one closes your door quite a bit, because that's a number, like we've been talking about, that's a number one hook for officers to be able to make arrests, serve warrants, et cetera. Same with probation, parole violations, right? That's what full legalization means, which means if somebody served time, you can't then use marijuana as something to pull somebody back into the system once they're out. So then that gets rid of a lot of your whole detention issues where you've got county jails that don't want to incarcerate people, but the feds and the state say they have to, whatever. So it's basically like, it would be just a critical undoing of what got us here. It's like, if we know what got us here, why would we not take those full backward steps as a first start, an easy first step, especially if you're going to make money off of it? That's the other thing that gets me. I don't understand how anybody in any state especially, can make money off of cannabis and then continue to utilize it as something to pull Black and brown people into the system. Like, that is I think that's just that's a crazy thing that we've been able to normalize as a country and as government decision makers. And so that's like a reckoning that I think once that happens, we'll have made a critical step towards trying to improve things in a meaningful way.
Can I say one thing? Because I amen to everything there. And this is just my new crusade. Drug courts are not the answer. And I think that's often come up. We need to take a public health approach. There are instances of substance misuse, and I don't want to not pretend those don't exist. But, Mickey referred to Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. When we see drug tests that were sort of predicated on the idea of drug court, there are 50,000 in last year in Philadelphia alone. Most of these tests were negative for any drug, but amongst the failed screens, 11,000 of them were positive for marijuana. And any sort of marijuana use. And so you basically take these 11,000 people and send them into drug court. 75% of people in Philadelphia are in drug court for cannabis, by the way, not opioids or other potentially more dangerous drugs. And then the failure rate, is over 50 or 60%. So you're basically saying, we're going to take this public health approach, we're going to make it about that, but you're still using the tools of the criminal legal system. And in many cases, it would have been, if you're being totally rational about it, if you were a defendant, it would have been more rational to just go to jail for some amount of time than go through drug court, because you're going to end up going to jail anyway, and you had to spend all the money for drug court and the time and missed opportunities and work opportunities. To Mickey's point, it needs to be taken out of the criminal legal sphere. Normal cannabis use, if it's their problematic use, we need to take a true public health approach to this.
Also, Sarah, I just wanted to add one other thing. It's also like, I mean, if, I think a lot of jurisdictions and at all levels are like always focused on the budget, but right now, a lot of budgets are in a really bad shape. And I think there are a lot of places that are looking at cannabis as a way to increase revenue, et cetera. Another way to increase revenue is to stop, like we talk about, when I was at Vera, we would talk about local jails, like county level jail, which again, entry point into the system, right? The thing that feeds our prisons, as the most expensive public safety tool that people don't even know they're paying for, and also isn't making you any safe, also is not actually having any impact on crime rates, and is also like having potentially making communities less safe, primarily like poor Black and brown communities. So ultimately, it's like incarceration doesn't make us any safer, and it's also really costly. So by legalizing marijuana, you're actually about like saving jail bed days, of what we would call, which is every day that there's not somebody in that jail, instead they're out in the community. That's also like saving taxpayer dollars. You have states like California, I forget what year, but I want to say early, probably mid 2000s, spent more on incarcerating their young people than they did on educating them and on like social services, something to that effect. But that just goes to show how like we are truly a carceral state. Like the thing that we pay most for is locking up people that most like that don't need to be there, and it's making them worse. It's making their lives way worse, and it's making our lives worse. But we continue to pay for it. But I think decision makers are recognizing that now. Like we have, for the first time ever, for whatever reasons, like some good, some less good, bipartisan support for criminal justice reform. Let's talk about how cannabis is a part of that. Cannabis is a part because people can't afford it, the human toll, the financial toll. Cannabis is something that is contributing to that, and like is a really simple and direct way to solve towards that, because also these decision makers, for the most part, agree that nonviolent cannabis offenders is one thing that we've got bipartisan support on, shouldn't really be incarcerated. So why do we continue to let people be pulled in for it? It's just like, I mean, a human toll, financial toll, et cetera, it just all makes sense. Like what we're doing right now makes zero sense. So.
And I think that's so right, that especially right now, the economic upside to not only decarceration, but to the legalization of cannabis can absolutely be the tool that we use to get, especially some of these state and local jurisdictions, to see all of the benefits that legalization could bring, but especially to not just the economic benefits of the industry, but the ancillary economic benefits of redressing, mass incarceration, law enforcement budgets, et cetera. Okay, we have 7 minutes. We have a ton of awesome questions. I'm going to try to combine some so that I can try to get to as many questions as we can. But one of them actually was about access and cannabis as medicine. And I think that touches, Natalie, on a point you just raised, which, and this ties in with another question, why is it that the opioid epidemic has been framed as a public health problem? And yet cannabis, which now a vast majority of states recognize as medicine, hasn't had that same approach taken by public officials.
I'm going to be very blunt. The face of the opioid victim in America is white. The face of the crack epidemic was Black. And you can just look at the news. I mean, I will send anyone who wants one New York Times articles from the 80s around the crack epidemic, and then New York Times articles from last month around the opioid epidemic, and just look at the imagery, look at the language, victim versus perpetrator. We're still even seeing that now with, we have some synthetic marijuana issues in New York City, and to see how, people who are suffering through, problematic use of those, and to see how they're painted today in our esteemed newspapers, while on, A2, we have an opioid epidemic story. It's pretty cut and dry. There's a racism to the coverage. And I that's not to say I am very happy that we are taking a more public health focused approach to the opioid epidemic. There's vast human consequences and negative, human consequences, economic consequences, just general public health and safety consequences to taking this carceral approach to problematic substance use. And so I'm glad we're learning from our mistakes. But the reason we're doing it is because the people look differently. And, last thing, crack epidemic, media frenzy for sure, political frenzy. It was weaponized for political gains. The number of people consuming crack had started to fall before, it had been falling for 6 years before we declared a war on crack. It was already decreasing, because if we're going to be totally honest, crack only appeals to a small subset of people. That's not to say there wasn't a lot of violence associated with the crack trade, but let's just call it what it is. Most of that can be attributed to our policies around incarcerating and letting these sort of like criminal enterprises flourish because of our very, very strict prohibitionist policies. And the other thing is, there were always, and there continue to be, more white crack users than Black crack users. Crack babies myth, all of that stuff that we learned about in our Students Against Destructive Decisions courses, and we read about and we watch movies about, lots of that are not total inaccuracies, they're lies. And we need to reckon with that as well.
If I can add to that, only because it's something that I learned from Natalie, is also like the fact that, like you mentioned, Natalie, when we were talking the other day, Natalie mentioned how, I just learned that the crack like crack use was actually declining. But what I found crazy, I mean, I think we all knew this intuitively, but the war on drugs talked about crack, but what resulted is the policies that resulted from that public panic, anxiety, and stoking of racial bias and fear is crack laws are actually about cannabis now. It's like it turns into a war on cannabis, even though it was a war on crack. And so I think that that's just like still to this day blows my mind. So it's like part of this is really just a story that we've been told. Like all this harm and suffering on behalf of Black and brown communities that continues to compound and evolve and be exacerbated is based on a lie, and a lie that is founded in white supremacy and white supremacist fears and the desire to control Black and brown people. And like, we all know this and we continue to talk about it, but it's just like a blatant lie. Anyway, I just learned that piece of it. And so I wanted to make sure anybody that was listening got to hear that too.
No, but I think that speaks to, Natalie, what you're saying, and this addresses one of our questions, which is, this is not taught in schools. There is not a robust education campaign to unpack the propaganda machine that was at work when these laws were put in place and that continue to cause these disparities. So one thing I will say, though, a question about, how do we educate, and particularly how do we educate young people? Certainly that is a big part of what we're trying to do at Last Prisoner Project. And a huge part of what Natalie has done at Equity.org is make very digestible content for social media to understand, what really was at play when these laws were enacted and the problem that still exists to this day. And I've been really impressed by the data-driven analysis that you guys have put forward, and that certainly will be continuing to highlight with our social media feeds and these kinds of webinars. I'm going to ask you guys for our last question. I'm going to give you a loaded one that I think touches on a lot of the questions that are coming up in the Q&A. We're in a moment where a lot of us might not be feeling incredibly optimistic or hopeful about the upcoming presidential election or what's going on federally with cannabis reform. But we are in a moment where these issues are really being heightened, especially how do we redress the disparities in the criminal justice system. Both of you, I'm going to ask you, is there hope, particularly on the federal level, that we can see true reform, both to legalization as well as the reimagining of our justice system?
Okay, that was a tough one. So yes, there is. We've seen, I think I spent a lot of this time kind of, forgive my French, like shitting on the government, but we have seen, that's not to say we have not seen valuable work being done, and we have made progress. And so there is, and I think now with this great awakening, as I like to call it, in all elements of society, people who normally don't engage with these issues, I think as long as we continue to educate in a way that's accessible and reaches people who might not already be on our side or might not be as well versed in these issues, we're going, and then vote accordingly and put pressure on they work for us. Give them a call. I'm always calling someone. They're probably screening my number at this point. Like, we need to make our voices heard. That's the wonderful thing about this country. There is an opportunity here to really make change, and we should capitalize on it in this momentum. It won't be here forever. And that's why Mickey, Sarah, and I are like, working all, day in and day out, because this is a moment and we can't let it sort of pass by without any meaningful reforms. And we see our politicians, a lot of them, some of it's misguided, some of it's mean-spirited, but some people just aren't aware of this. Like, we work in this all the time and we're learning something new every single day. So our goal is to empower, we'll do this ourselves, but also empower the cannabis community and allies to help people understand these issues and help people untangle that narrative and that propaganda, and then act accordingly.
I guess I'll go. So I'm more cynical when it comes to government. Like, on a personal level, I don't believe in system solutions, and I don't really believe in government to solve this. But I do have hope because I have hope in like people, and like every all these institutions are made up of people, and all these constituent bases are made up of people. And so I have faith in, like, I have hope in people's ability to empathize, listen, and think critically about what their role is in all of this. The role in how white supremacy is perpetuated, role in bias, role in all of these things. So it's like figuring out where you sit, where you can do better, and where you can help. And also recognizing that your decision makers in our government, everybody at some point is just worried about re-election, and they will listen to their constituents. I've seen decision makers I never thought make decisions I never thought they would, only because the public and the pressures that they were felt beholden to changed. So government doesn't change until the people do, and our government hasn't changed because our people haven't. So I don't have hope in our government, but I do have hope in our people. So that's where I'll stop.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave it, because at Last Prisoner Project, we are definitely leveraging the power of the people. If you want to get involved, we have a ton of calls to action going on right now that you can get involved in. It's lastprisonerproject.org/get involved. So that's a great place to start. Thank you so much to Mickey and Natalie. This was an amazing conversation. I am incredibly grateful that you guys are leading the charge on this front for the Last Prisoner Project. And thank you to everyone that was here today in the audience and gave us some amazing questions. And we will see you all next month. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.